Welcome to Figments of the Brain, a philosophy podcast recorded at the University of Cologne. Figments of the Brain is produced by Concept, the Cologne Center of Contemporary Epistemology and the Kantian Tradition. Every episode we pick a topic for a roundtable discussion among the members of Concept. Sometimes we also interview other philosophers on a selected topic. We welcome your feedback. To get in touch and learn more about the center, please visit www.concept-phil.de. That's www.concept-phil.de. We hope you enjoy our podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to the Knowledge Router hosted by the University of Cologne and Concept. It's our pleasure today to host Mona Simion, who will be giving a talk titled The Puzzle for the Normativity of Inquiry. Mona is a professor of philosophy and deputy director of Cogito at the University of Glasgow. She's on the executive committee for the Aristotelian Society, an editor for the Philosophical Quarterly, a PI on a large ERC grant on knowledge-first social epistemology. She's the author of Shifty Speech and Independent Thought with OUP. She's an editor for another volume with OUP. She's got further books in progress and too many publications to list, while also allowing her enough time to talk to us today. Once Mona finishes her talk, comments will be provided by Lisa Bastian. She has her PhD from St. Andrews. She's an assistant professor at VU Amsterdam. And she'll be followed by Wes Cisco, who has a PhD from University of Arizona and is a postdoc here at the University of Cologne. And with that, Mona, please introduce us to this puzzle.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And thanks a lot to Lisa and Wes for, going through the trouble to read this stuff, and for the lovely comments. So about this talk, it is part of this project that you mentioned, Paul, on knowledge for social epistemology, in that it is part of the methodological part of it. So the beginning of the project tries to set up a knowledge-first methodology for social epistemology, in that the assumption is that it's going to be a bit harder to do than the way in which we just did it for individual epistemology. We can't just say, well, if, justification for individual belief is knowledge, then we can just, take that as given for social epistemic phenomena as well, because social epistemic phenomena are just very complex, right? Just include a lot of people and artifacts and other such things. So the project is trying to set up a way to think in knowledge first fashion about social epistemic phenomena. And that's the kind of the work package that I'm working on right now, and that's the work package that was kind of affected by this puzzle that I'm going to be talking about. So the puzzle is put forth by Jane Friedman in a recent field review paper. And I'm going to first talk about the puzzle, and then I'm going to look at 3 ways out of it and tell you, of course, that they don't work, and finally give you my solution. So here's the puzzle. Here's the project first. So the project, very roughly, I cut a few slides from what I had planned to tell you about the project, because I'm giving so many talks at Cologne that I can't possibly do this to you every time, just go through everything that the project does, I thought. So very roughly what the project is trying to do now, in terms of methodology, is to take knowledge to be the aim of the practice of inquiry. So what I mean by the practice of inquiry is not what we would normally mean in layman talk, like not the practice of consciously asking questions or something like that. On this understanding of inquiry is a fairly lowbrow affair, whereby when I walk down the street and I form various beliefs about stuff happening around me, I am, in the middle of the practice of inquiry. So all of these beliefs are parts of my, inquiring in the world. So I take, I look at the practice of inquiry, I take knowledge to be the aim of it. And I take all of our, epistemic kind of, actions and states to be part of this practice, to be moves in it, in the same way in which, moving the rook is a move in chess, in the practice of chess, if you wish. So along similar lines, I think, social epistemological interactions, such as, testimonial exchanges or kind of, group beliefs or disagreements, I take them to be moves in the practice of inquiry, and thereby to aim at the goal of the practice, which is knowledge. right? So then basically what I end up with is a picture on which the function of the social epistemic interactions is to generate knowledge in virtue of them being moves in the practice. Just like the function of every move in the practice of chess is to eventually generate a checkmate, because that's the goal of the practice of chess, right? So that's roughly the model. So in particular, the way I do it is, given that I take all of these practices to be aimed at generating knowledge, I can also figure out what norms govern these social epistemic interactions by looking back, as it were, after knowledge has been generated, at what went well in the interaction. So in the same way in which, we figure out what a properly functioning heart is by looking at what went well when it fulfilled its function, right? So you take a heart that actually pumps blood in the circulatory system, which is, I take it, the function of the heart, and you look at how it's functioning in order to figure out how it's supposed to function, right? So, a normally functioning heart is it's a heart that beats at a particular rate. I don't know precisely what the normal rate is. I'm assuming it's a range from somewhere to 80 to 120. I don't know exactly. So, hearts reliably fulfill their functions when they work in that way, when they beat at a rate between 80 and 120, which is why we call a heart that doesn't beat at that rate a malfunctioning heart, because it will not in normal conditions reliably fulfill its function of pumping blood. So in the same way, I take knowledge to be the function of social epistemic interactions. I look at how it is generated in normal conditions, and that's going to give me the content of the normal of how this social epistemic interaction should go. Right? So that's the methodology. But notice that because this is the methodology, the upshot of all of this thing is that, on my view, social epistemic norms are inquiry norms or zetetic norms, right? And, that's kind of part of my general, epistemological views of, a pretty well-fitting part of all of my work, in that all of my work in individual epistemology also assumes this kind of picture, right? This kind of functionalist knowledge first picture, whereby norms for absolutely everything are generated by this knowledge function of the practice of inquiry. So in a nutshell, an assumption that underlies most of my work, but more importantly for present purposes, this entire research project, is that epistemic norms are inquiry norms, right? So if there's a problem with that assumption, I wasted many years of my life publishing many papers, as Paul pointed out, but it's also the case that this entire research project collapses. So that's one thing that I don't want to, right? I don't want it to be the case that it turns out that there's, a really big problem with the claim that epistemic norms just are norms of inquiry, zetetic norms. And that's exactly what Jane Friedman argues. That's the claim that Jane Friedman argues for in this recent paper I was mentioning. So here is the case that she puts forth. The Chrysler Building, she calls it. Say, for instance, that I want to know how many windows the Chrysler Building in Manhattan has. I decided the best way to figure this out is to head down there myself and do a count. To do my counting, I set up outside of Grand Central Station. Say it takes me an hour of focused work to get the count done and figure out how many windows that building has. During that hour, there are many other ways that I could make epistemic gains. There's obviously a huge amount of facts around me that I can come to know. Okay, so remember the setting. I'm in front of Grand Central Station. I could come to know a bunch of things. There's a man in a green hat leaving the station right now. There's a woman with a red bag that just entered it. It's raining outside. All kinds of things are happening in front of the station. But I am busy counting the windows on the Chrysler Building, right? So that's the situation. So what is the puzzle? You might wonder, well, here is the puzzle as Friedman sees it. She takes a paradigmatic zetetic norm to be zip. If one wants to figure out Q, then one ought to take the necessary means to figuring out Q. So if I want to figure out how many windows there are in the Chrysler Building, I ought to take the necessary means to figure that out. I ought to count. And then a paradigmatic epistemic norm, she takes it, is KPA. If one is in a position to know proposition P, then one is permitted to come to know that P. But she thinks in the Chrysler Building case, ZIP and KPA come into conflict. But now, if it's true that they come into conflict in this case, notice that there's nothing spectacularly special about this case. It's just a normal everyday case of inquiry, right? So, we engage in kind of garden variety, in this kind of garden variety inquiries all the time, right? And it would seem to follow that whenever we do, we are faced by a similar conflict. So it would seem to follow that norms of inquiry, garden varieties, norms of inquiry like zip, come in conflict with garden variety epistemic norms like KPA all the time. Whenever I want to, figure out whether there's milk in the fridge, we have epistemic conflict. That's what this puzzle Friedman thinks shows. So here are the three claims involved in the puzzle. E equals Z, epistemic norms are zetetic norms. Now it's important to note here that we need to restrict for E equals Z to even be plausible. Not all zetetic norms are going to be epistemic norms, right? So it's not going to work right to left. But I want you to forget about that for a moment. So of course, there are going to be, moral norms of inquiry, moral norms that say, go and figure out the treatment for cancer to save the world, or, prudential norms of inquiry, go and figure out, whether there are bullets in the gun or something like that, right? So obviously equals Z can't be true. So we need a restricted version of Z here, right? But I want you to forget about that. So I will take all kind of, all other sorts of inquiry norms out of the picture. The question that we're asking is it the case that all epistemic norms are norms or inquiry? So we don't care about the other direction of explanation. So that's the first claim, E equals Z, epistemic norms are zetetic norms. Easy conflict. Zetetic norms and epistemic norms lead to normative conflicts on a large scale, on the assumption that there's conflict in the Chrysler Building case, and that the Chrysler Building case is a garden variety case of inquiry. And internal harmony, there can be no large-scale normative conflicts within a given normative domain. So these are the claims that Jane thinks come in conflict and give rise to this puzzle in that they're inconsistent. Of course, there are going to be three solutions to this puzzle. Then you can deny E equals Z, you can deny easy conflict, or you can deny internal harmony. Okay, so let's start with the first. The first solution is deny E equals Z. You might think, well, that's not the most obvious one, especially since I don't want to do it because my entire, my life's work collapses. But I want to get it out of the way. So I'm going to first talk about this because I want to get it out of the way. I also gonna start talking about it because it is, you'll be surprised to find out, one of the most popular ways to go in the literature. Now, this is not a popular way to go in the sense in which it's a reaction to Friedman's puzzle. It's just that people, in the absence of Friedman's puzzle, have considered the question as to the relationship between epistemic norms, proper as it were, so the kind of standard epistemic norms, and inquiry norms in their work, and have dismissed that there be any relation between them. Remember, E equals Z is the main methodological assumption behind my project, so I really don't want it to fail. So let's see if there's any reason to think that it does. So Sosa, in his forthcoming book, explicitly looks into the issue as to the status of the zetetic norms. So, and he says that zetetic norms, i.e. norms as to what questions to take up, pertain to intellectual ethics, not to theory of knowledge proper. So it's one thing, the ethics of belief, as it were, the ethics of what I should believe, or the ethics of what I should inquire into. And it's another thing, epistemic normativity, right? Thomas Kelly also makes a similar claim. He says epistemology deals with the proper handling of evidence that we have, not with norms of gathering evidence, right? Again, a denial of E equals Z. Hawthorne and Srinivasan, in unrelated work on disagreement, put forth a knowledge norm of disagreement that implies that one is permitted to suspend on P if one doesn't know that P. So one is permitted to suspend rather than obligated to go and search for evidence or something like that. All right, so there are quite prominent people who believe E equals Z doesn't hold. So if they're right, we don't have the puzzle to begin with. So here's the problem why we should really not want to deny E equals Z. Now, here's a garden variety case of testimonial injustice adapted from Lackey. You have the case of sexist scientist Bill, who doesn't believe anything his female colleagues say. Suppose Bill carries out 2 experiments to test his hypothesis that P. Experiment 1 strongly supports that P. Experiment 2 strongly supports that non-P. The scientist comes to suspend on P on this basis. Suppose next that the female colleague of his, Anna, discovers a serious flaw with experiment 2, which she points out to Bill. Due to sexist bias, Bill discounts Anna's word and maintains his suspension on P. Now notice that Bill never takes up the question as to whether experiment 2 is flawed. That's just a question that he doesn't take up at all. He takes up the question as to whether P, but the question as to whether his experiment into whether P is flawed, he never takes up. Why? Because of his sexist bias, right? But if you think that E doesn't equal Z, it's going to follow that a norm that says Bill ought to take up the question as to whether his experiment was flawed in light of Anna's testimony is a norm of inquiry, but it is not an epistemic norm. But if that's the case, it can't be that Bill is unjustified in his suspension, because only epistemic norms can affect epistemic justification. So if you want to say that the norm that says, Bill, you should have revisited the issue of the quality of your experiment in the light of this woman's testimony, if you want to say that norm is not an epistemic norm, you're going to get the result, which I take it is counterintuitive, that Bill is perfectly justified to believe, to suspend on P. So that's a problem, right? Notice also that the gender-related aspects of the case are purely contingent. You can replace Anna with George, and things are not going to get any better. They never do. Here is another case that makes denying E equals Z problematic. This is a paradigmatic case of higher order defeat. No, sorry, this was about the previous case. Here is the second case. Consider Dr. X, who believes that B, stress causes stomach ulcers, but missed a widely known recent development in the field that Q stomach ulcers are caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria. X does not justify belief that P. After all, this is a paradigmatic case of normative defeat. The case is put forth in Goldberg 2018 as such, right? So if we have such a thing as normative defeat, this is just a classic case. Q is a defeater for this belief, which undermines X's justification for believing that P, right? Again, since we know that only epistemic norms can affect one's epistemic justification, it seems to suggest that the norm that says Dr. X should look into recent developments in the field of medicine is an epistemic norm, because otherwise it can't affect the good doctor's justification. But if it is an epistemic norm and the norm of inquiry at the same time, it follows that E equals Z, so we can't deny it. So that didn't work. That's good news for me. Bad news for the puzzle. Second solution, deny easy conflict. Remember that what easy conflict was all about. Easy conflict was James Friedman's claim that zetetic norms and epistemic norms lead to normative conflicts on a large scale. And the reason why she thought that was because she thought there was conflict in the Chrysler Building case, and she also thought that the Chrysler Building case was a garden variety case, and thereby there is reason to suspect that it's going to generalize. So one way to do that is the way that Chris Kelp likes, and he has a paper on this, whereby you distinguish norms about inquiry from norms of inquiry. So in that way, you have norms that are internal to the domain of inquiry, zetetic norms proper, and then you have norms about engaging in the activity of inquiry, right? So think about tennis, because it's also a kind of norm-constituted domain like inquiry is. So there are going to be norms about when it's okay to play tennis, which can be politeness norms or prudential norms or what have you, right? Or moral norms. It's not okay to play tennis when there's a child drowning in front of you. That's the norm about tennis, not a norm of tennis, not a norm constitutive of the domain. Norms about tennis are, things like, I don't know any norm of tennis. If the ball is out of the field, then your opponent gains 1 point or whatever. So that's the distinction that I'm looking for. So one thing that you can think is that maybe zip is not really a norm of inquiry proper, so zetetic norm internal to the domain, but a norm about inquiry, right? Why would you think that? Well, here is why. Constitutive norms are not desire conditional, but zip is, right? So zip says if one wants to figure out Q, then 1 or 2, so and so. But constitutive norms don't work like that. When I play tennis, it's not up to my desire whether I'm governed by the norms of tennis. Whether I desire them to be governing me or not. They will govern my game of tennis because they're constitutive. That's just how it goes with constitutive norms. They essentially govern the constituted item. Of course, I can feel free to stop playing tennis, in which case I'm not governed by these norms anymore. But it is not up to my desire whether I am governed by them as soon as I'm engaging in tennis, right? If constitutive norms, however, are not desired conditional, it's going to follow that zip is not a zetetic norm proper, but it is a norm about inquiry, and then we don't have the E equals Z problem anymore. Unfortunately, it's very easy to revamp zip such that now it becomes an internal norm internal to the domain. Instead of making it desire conditional, you're making it engagement conditional, like I did with tennis earlier. So now zip prime is going to say something like, if you're engaging in an inquiry aimed at figuring out Q, then you ought to take the necessary means to figuring out Q, right? So now it looks pretty much like the constitutive norm of tennis that I was talking about earlier. If you're engaging in a game of tennis, then you ought to, plug in your favorite tennis norm. So if this norm is also looking quite plausible, right? Think back to the Chrysler building case. If you're engaging in counting, then you ought to take the necessary means to figuring out how many, windows there are. You're going to get a revamped version of the Friedman puzzle, right? So zip revamped is going to give you Friedman puzzle revamped with zip prime. So we're back where we started. Here is another way to deny easy conflict. You might think that there is no conflict to begin with. Indeed, maybe when you first saw the alleged puzzle on my slide, that's the first thing that came to your mind. How do you mean this is a puzzle? That's a permission, and the other one is an obligation. Permissions and obligations never come in conflict. You should always do what the obligation tells you to do. The permission doesn't mind, by definition, right? So you might think, well, there's no normative conflict in the Chrysler building case to begin with. Zip is an obligation, KPA is a permission, right? And it's a common normative phenomenon that obligations trump permissions. Now, I think that that's an easy way to dismiss Jane's paper. I think that there is also, though, an intuitive way in which there is a bit of conflict there, in that at the end of the day, the obligation claim tells you that you're not permitted to form beliefs about, the man in the green hat exiting the station, while the permission claim tells you that you are permitted to form beliefs about that man. So in a way, there is a contradiction there. But at the normative level, there's absolutely no conflict, right? Totally agree with that. The problem is, again, that even if you, kind of pick this easy to pick fruit, low-hanging fruit, and go via this route against Jane Friedman's puzzle, it will reappear because, as a matter of fact, it is plausible to think that KPA can be restated as a not claim. It can be restated as an obligation. And we've seen already reasons to believe that the epistemic obligations are, plausible, right? We've seen the epistemic injustice cases. What is happening in that case is not that the scientist is permitted to believe based on the woman colleague testimony, is that he's obliged to take that testimony up, which he doesn't do. That's why there's something wrong with the case. Not if you were merely permitted, there would be absolutely nothing wrong with what sexist scientist does, right? In general, cases of testimonial injustice are cases where epistemic obligation is breached, right? Not epistemic permission. There's also cognitive penetration cases, which are also cases of epistemic obligation, right? So you have a breach of epistemic obligation, you have all of these people who look, perfectly friendly and smiling, but you see them as angry because of your racist bias or something like that. That's another breach of epistemic obligation. You should see them as smiling because that's, the content that, a properly functioning perceptual mechanism delivers, but because of your racist bias, you see them as angry. And classic cases of breach of epistemic obligation also include belief against evidence more broadly due to motivated reasoning and wishful thinking, right? People who don't believe climate change is happening due to identity protection type of reasoning and so on, right? So all of these are breaches of epistemic obligation, which tells us that we can't dismiss Friedman's puzzle as easily as just saying, well, KPA is just a permission, so there's no conflict at all, because we can just restate it as an obligation. Here it is, let's call it KPB. So now we have two odd claims, now we have trivially conflict, right? So that didn't work. Let's go through the the third way to go about dismissing the puzzle, which is to deny the internal harmony claim that I was talking about. So remember, internal harmony it says that there can't be large-scale normative conflicts within a given normative domain. You might think that that doesn't need to be the case. Maybe it's perfectly fine to have large-scale normative conflicts within a given normative domain. You might think actually it's a common phenomenon. You know, you have all of these cases in the ethics class, right, that you see when you promise to come for lunch at 12 and you thereby have a moral obligation to do so, and then you encounter a drowning child on the way, and now you have a moral obligation to save the child. There are two moral obligations in conflict. One of them is going to have to go. You're probably, you know, if you're the righteous moral agent, going to choose to breach the obligation to go on time to lunch and jump in the water to save the child. Nothing strange about that. We have a vast amounts of work on normative overriding, weighing reasons and all of that, and that's because morality is also peppered with normative conflict. So that makes it such that it's not that bad if epistemology is as well. The problem is that it's not that easy in Friedman's puzzle. It's not as easy as with the child to figure out which one is the overriding norm, right? I mean, we might want on pain of prior plausibility to say that clearly we want zip to override, right? Because we don't want it to be the case that we are never allowed to engage in inquiries because we're busy forming beliefs about people in green hats leaving the station, right? So we should not get the result that you're not allowed to count those windows on the Chrysler building because you're busy forming beliefs about random stuff happening at the station, right? But how to figure out why that's overriding, that is at the end of the day, the homework that Jane Friedman has given us in this paper, right? So in a way, one way to think about it is instead of thinking about it as a mere conflict, we can start to think about it as a dilemma. Why is it that I'm allowed to choose one leg, one obligation over another in the Friedman case? And you can revamp it then in terms of dilemmas, right? So instead of saying there can't be large-scale normative conflict in this field, which we've seen, you know, other normative fields also feature large-scale normative conflict, we can revamp it in terms of dilemmas and make it even more plausible, right? You might think, well, normative domains can feature a lot of conflict, but featuring a lot of dilemmas is not great, right? So that's a problem. Now, one might think that maybe that's not that big a problem either. So you might, for instance, think in line with Sandy Goldberg that epistemic normativity is grounded in social norms, in social expectations. So if you are like Sandy like that, you're not going to have trouble accommodating the thought that there's large-scale normative dilemmas because there is large-scale conflict, dilemmatic conflict between social norms that we know that is perfectly possible because social norms are norms of our own making. So it's not very hard to generate social norms that are going to give you dilemmas because we build them, so we are free to do as we please, as it were. So if Sand is right and epistemic normativity reduces to social normativity, that might explain why we get a dilemmatic domain, a densely dilemmatic domain, right? Social expectations often face us with dilemmas. You know, we can, what should I do? Should I, you know, go to biology school like my mom wants me to go, or should I go to, you know, art school like my dad wants me to do? Here's a social norm dilemma for you. We have those all the time, right? And so Sandy thinks that that's what's going on. So Sandy thinks that the sexist scientist, for instance, and Dr. X, the reason why they're in breach of epistemic normativity is because they don't meet the social expectations concerning what questions they should take up, right? The problem with going this way, first of all, is that there are such things as epistemically legitimate and epistemically illegitimate social expectations, right? So in many places on Earth, we're socially expected not to believe women or people of color. That's an epistemically illegitimate social expectation. But if we ground our epistemic normativity in social normativity, we cannot have epistemically illegitimate social expectations in virtue of our theory. It's impossible because all epistemic normativity is grounded in social normativity. So that's a bad result, right? Another bad result is that is actually even going this way is not going to be very helpful because it looks as though there are going to be social expectations about inquiry, right? Like, for instance, my dad's expectation to go to biology school. So that's a social expectation about what I should inquire into. And then there's going to be social expectation in inquiry, right? Just like we've seen with epistemic normativity. So those are going to be presumably the epistemically relevant ones. But so those, like the social expectation governing Dr. X is staying up to date with results in his field. But how to make a distinction between those in order to get the result that only the latter matter for justification, but the former don't? Because clearly, even if I breach my father's expectation to go to biology school, that's not going to result in me having unjustified beliefs in any way. It's very hard to see, given that we all is, the same, all is social normativity, how to make a distinction between the relevant and the irrelevant social normativity, as it were. So that didn't work. Finally, my solution. So recall Friedman's puzzle, right? We've seen that there are these three claims. Epistemic norms are synthetic norms. I don't want to deny that. I can't. I don't want to deny internal harmony either. I think it's, at least at first, I'm not particularly worried about dilemmas myself. I think they're very rare. So because I think they're very rare, I think that it is implausible that the epistemic domain is peppered with them. So I'm going to just go for denying easy conflict. So I'm going to deny the claim that synthetic norms and epistemic norms don't lead to normative dilemmas. So remember ZIP and KPB. My claim is basically there's no conflict between them, right? So let's read them again. If you're engaging in an inquiry aimed at figuring out Q, then you ought to take the necessary means to figuring out Q. That's it. KPB, if one is in a position to know proposition P, then one ought to come to believe that P. So here is why I think they're not in conflict. Notice that KPB features being in a position to know condition, right? So that's what's happening in the antecedent. My claim is that being in a position to know is more restricted than we take it to be, that it's not that broad and wide and permissive. So I think that one thing that's plausible is that given that we are limited creatures, that there are limitations on what we are in a position to know, right? So let's start with that. That seems plausible. There are limitations on what we are in a position to find in general. That's just what it is to be a limited being, right? So here are some limitations, and here is a bit of taxonomy. I'm not claiming it's an exclusive taxonomy, but I think it's an informative one. So I think there's going to be qualitative limitations on what I'm in a position to know. So, for instance, a cognizer of my type can come to know that there's a computer in front of me right now, but I can't come to know what my colleague Glenn Pettigrove is doing in the office next door because I can't see through this wall, right? So you notice that my kind of account of being in a position to know is indeed a very narrow one. So I distinguish between being in a position to know and being in a position to come to know. Of course, I am in a position to come to know what Glenn is doing by going and knocking on his door, but I'm not in a position to know it from where I stand now because I can't see through the wall. So being in a position to know, just like Tim Williams, and I take it, is just that kind of thing whereby if I just form the belief in the right way, I can come to know it. So I have everything else at my disposal. I don't need to start digging, opening books, knocking on doors, and so on. There are also going to be quantitative limitations on what I'm in a position to know, right? So a cognizer of my type can only know, a particular amount of things, right? So, even simple arithmetical truths, I can't know them all because I'm just, too limited to form so many beliefs, right? And there are going to be what I call environmental limitations on being in a position to know that are going to pertain to, the laws of nature and social norms. The laws of nature are going to kind of decide the limitations that pertain to my physical environment, right? And the social norms are going to decide the limitations that pertain to my social environment. So the first one is easy. I'm not going to talk about it, but the second one pertains to things like, well, I'm in a position to know what's written in the letter in front of me on the table, but I'm not in a position to know what's written in the letter under the doormat. Why is that? Well, because there's a social norm that I'm not supposed to look under the doormat for letters. That's not a thing that we do in the society, right? So that's very roughly, and again, very rough taxonomy, not exclusive at all. But very roughly what I think being in a position to know is the following. S is in a position to know a fact F if and only if S has a cognitive process with the function of generating knowledge that can, and by can I mean what I discussed, with the restrictions that I talked about, qualitatively, quantitatively, and environmentally, easily uptake F in cognizers of S's type. Not very complicated at all. All I'm saying is you're in a position to know something insofar as you have a cognitive process that can take it up, right? It's important that this can, it is a not implies can, but it is a restricted version thereof. It's what's important is not what you can do, because you might be a sexist, and that's why you can't listen to women. Because of sexist bias, you just can't form beliefs based on their testimony. But a cognizer like you, an adult human being, can form beliefs based on women's testimony, right? So that's why the what implies can is restricted to the type of cognizer that you are, not to you what you can do in particular. Of course, I'm going to get a generality problem here. How do you mean the type that I am? Under some description, the type that I am is sexist cognizer. So then I can't come to know based on women. My type of cognizer can't come to know based on women's testimony. Generality problems are everywhere. I don't worry much about them. And I take it that it's quite intuitive when I mean the type of cognizer that you are, that I just mean adult human being with normal cognitive capacity. Furthermore, I've argued in previous work for this account of evidence that's quite simple and nice and neat. So on my view of evidence, a fact E is evidence for a proposition P insofar as the relevant subject is in a position to know this fact in the sense that I described earlier, and the fact in question raises the probability of P being the case, right? So it's not, if you want, it's a being in a position to know version of Tim's account of evidence. So it's this fact that I'm talking about needs to be a probability raiser, and I need to be in a position to know, right? Correspondingly, I take defeaters to be probability lowerers, so ignorance indicators, as it were. I take a fact D to be a defeater for S is evidence E for P, if and only if, again, S is in a position to know D, and the probability for the relevant proposition conditional on the conjunction between the evidence, the conjunction of the evidence and the defeater is smaller than the probability conditional merely on the evidence. So this is just to say that it's a probability lowerer, the defeater. You have a particular probability based on your evidence, and then the defeater comes and lowers. Nothing really spectacular. What's important to keep in mind is that the relevant epistemic state at stake is being in a position to know that relevant fact rather than knowing it, as Williamson had it, for instance. What's the upshot of my view of evidence and my view of being in a position to know? So here are a few nice upshots. On my view, the sexist scientist will be unjustified, right? Why? Well, he is in a position to know from his colleagues' testimony, which cognizers like him can easily uptake with their knowledge-generating cognitive processes, that his experiment was flawed, right? The fact that his experiment was flawed lowers his evidential probability that P is the case, whatever the result of the experiment was. Therefore, on my view, is that the testimony from Anna, the colleague, is predicted to be a defeater. Notice that on any other view of evidence, it will not be predicted as such. For instance, on Williamson's view, this is not going to follow because the sexist scientist doesn't form the relevant belief. Therefore, on Williamson's view, he's not going to count as having any evidence that there's a flaw in the experiment. So being in a position to know does better than knowledge when it comes to the relationship that one needs to have with facts when they are to constitute evidence. Similarly, Dr. X, on my view, is going to come out as unjustified because cognizers like him are in a position to know widely available recent results in the field, like the fact that ulcers are caused by bacteria, because this epistemic norm that he should inquire into these things is constitutive of the type of cognizer that he is, a doctor, right? Or doctors are social roles, right? So that their social norm constitute. This fact in turn lowers the evidential probability that ulcers are caused by stress, which makes his corresponding belief unjustified. Again, defeaters thought about in terms of being in a position to know do better than in ways that involve mental states. And finally, the upshot for the Friedman puzzle. What I want to say about that is that we are cognitively limited cognizers, as we've seen. And in particular, I want to say that the quantitative limitations of being in a position to know are going to explain what's going on in this case. So if there are, as I think is plausible, quantitative limitations on what I'm in a position to know, this is going to imply the denial of conjunction introduction. What does that mean? That means that being in a position to know P, Q, and R and S individually will not imply being in a position to know P and Q and R and S, right? Because of the cognitive limitations, there are going to be limitations of how many things I am in a position to know at the same time, right? So, it doesn't matter where the limitations are, how, smart I am. The point is that at some point, my cognitive capacities end. So even though I'm in a position to know a million facts independently, I can't know them all at the same time. That means that I'm not in a position to know a bunch of facts around me while I'm counting the windows on the Chrysler building, right? Because just my cognitive apparatus is such that there's a limit to what I can do. So, maybe counting the windows still allows me to form a couple of beliefs about what's going on in front of the station, but definitely less so than I would have been able to form if I hadn't been counting the windows. So basically, the situation that I'm in now that I'm counting the windows is I am in a position to know the number of windows, and I am in a position to know that the man in a red hat is exiting the station, but I'm not in a position to know both that there are 46 windows and that there's a red man in a red hat exiting the station at the same time, right? A cognizer like myself is too cognitively limited to be able to process both of these pieces of information at the same time. And since we've seen that being in a position to know grounds obligations, which is my assumption, but it's also Jane Friedman's assumption, that's what grounds KPB, I am not subject to zip and KPB at the same time, right? So if I'm not in a position to know the conjunction, I cannot be subject to a conjunctive obligation on a view where obligations are grounded in a position to know. If I'm not subject to a conjunctive obligation, there's no epistemic dilemma. Epistemic dilemmas imply that one is subject to a conjunctive obligation. So that's the way I think about these things. Thanks a lot.
Unfortunately, on Zoom, we have to imagine grand applause, but imagine grand applause. All right, thank you. So next we'll have no more than 10 minutes of comments from each of Wes and Lisa. Lisa, would you like to take it from here?